taking aim at British fighters who support ISIL in Iraq and Syria. Prime Minister David Cameron unveils measures to prevent them from coming home. But what's to stop suspects from facing prosecution under existing laws? And what sort of precedent could this set? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Mike Hanna. It was a moment when the fight against ISIL in Syria and Iraq was brought into shocking focus. Videos released online said to show the beheading of 2 US journalists and then 2 British aid workers. A man who appears to be their killer speaks with an English accent, later named Jihadi John. The British Prime Minister condemned the murders as absolutely abhorrent, senseless, truly repulsive and barbaric, and promised action to counter what he said was a threat to national security. Now he has outlined that action in more detail. Under the proposals, British fighters in Iraq and Syria could be barred from returning home for 2 years, with an option to extend that unless they agree to certain strict conditions. Suspects would have their passports cancelled and their names put on a no-fly list. Decisions will be made on the basis of what the proposal calls reasonable suspicion of involvement in terrorist activity.
And we will shortly be introducing our own new counter-terrorism bill in the United Kingdom. New powers for the police at ports to seize passports, to stop suspects travelling, and to stop British nationals returning to the UK unless they do so on our terms. New rules to prevent airlines that don't comply with our no-fly lists or our security screening measures from landing in the UK.
Well, the plans form part of the counter-terrorism bill, which could be law by the end of January. But some critics are concerned they could compromise existing laws on immigration, citizenship and human rights. And it raises the question, why can't suspects be arrested and charged if authorities believe they have reasonable suspicion under existing laws? All issues to be discussed by our panel of guests. All in London, we have Hannah Stewart, a research fellow at the Henry Jackson Society, specialising in anti-extremist policies in the UK. Also on the panel is Anjem Chowdhury, a Muslim social and political activist. And completing our lineup is Margaret Gilmore, a senior associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI. Welcome to you all. Let's begin with Hannah Stewart. What is your immediate reaction to this proposed legislation?
I think that the proposed legislation is actually potentially very effective, particularly the ability to remove suspects' passports when they're attempting to travel to Syria, because I think that's one of the big aims of the government, is to prevent further travel and therefore prevent individuals who are already on the cusp of radicalisation from being further brutalised by time spent in Syria. The other proposal, the temporary exclusion orders, are definitely more controversial, and that we still need to see the detail as to how they're going to work. But as I said, I think they could be very useful, at least in staging the return of people who have demonstrably gone abroad and fought for a terrorist organisation that has openly threatened our way of life in Britain.
Well, Anjem Chowdhury, your view?
Well, I mean, there's absolutely no empirical evidence to support the fact that people are actually coming back to Britain to carry out operations. This particular measure is targeting the Muslim community. In effect, what David Cameron is saying is that we can bomb you in Iraq and Syria, we can kill innocent people, and if there's any retaliation, then it's the fault of the Muslim community. Yet again, the Muslims are being demonized and vilified. And in fact, if we look from 2010 until today, not one person has in fact returned to Britain. You know, since the Arab Spring, there's no example of anyone carrying out a plot in this country. I think what this will in fact do is push people into the arms of the Islamic State. Those people who are already abroad will say, well, what's the point of coming back if I'm going to be arrested? And those people who would go abroad and support their brethren overseas and stand with them in jihad, they will think to themselves, well, I may as well carry out an operation here to defend and protect my Muslim brothers over there. In other words, bring the war to Britain and America. So I think it will have the reverse effect to what is intended from the British government.
Well, Margaret Gilmore, your view?
Well, I think it's going to make people think twice about travelling out. I think that actually there's plenty of evidence that people have gone out there and come back. People who go out to fight with ISIS are quite happy to go onto the internet and boast about what they're doing, and the intelligence agencies also are following networks. They know who is coming back. I think one of the positives out of this, and I do have some reservations, but one of the positives out of this is that those who go and fight with ISIS and then decide they want to move on now know that they can come back, they can come to the border, they can say they want to re-engage with mainstream Muslim thinking, they want to rejoin their families, and they are happy to engage in radicalisation, counter-radicalisation schemes in order to try and move back and move on in their lives. And I think that is a good thing and will be welcomed by the majority of mainstream Muslims.
Well, Anjem Chowdhury, that statement you made about none having come back who have fought, that is a debatable point, is it not?
Well, you know, there is no evidence of anyone having returned from 2010 until today. And in fact, if you look at the Muslims who are in the Islamic State, they want to live there, they want to experience the Sharia there. Indeed, there are many reports of people having burnt their passports. And in fact, they are inviting more people to join them. So I think the problem that the British government have is that the Islamic State is no longer an organizational body. They're not some kind of guerrilla warfare, outfit. It is a state which is bigger than England. People are going abroad. And by all accounts, it's completely absurd to think that if someone was to return to this country, knowing that they were going to be arrested, that they would come on their own passport. I mean, surely they would come on a different passport. They would completely disguise themselves. And, if they wanted to attack England, I think it would be very easy. This is a gimmick from David Cameron to further tarnish and demonize the Muslim community. I think the message that it really sends to the Muslim community is that even if you are born here and you have a British passport, you're never really safe of having your passport taken or being made citizenless or really being turfed out of this country. Because let's face it, if your, name is John or Fred, and you want to go as a journalist to places like Syria or Iraq, they're not going to take away your passport and say you can go away for 2 years. There'll be an outcry. But it's the open season to attack Muslims nowadays.
Well, Hannah Stewart, I saw that you wanted to say something there.
Yes, I'd just like to respond to Anjem's point. I think it's a huge myth that there isn't a blowback from foreign conflicts, foreign jihadist conflicts or foreign fighters. We've looked at the Henry Jackson Society, we've looked at Islamism-inspired terrorism convictions over the last 15 years, and 1 in 5 of every individual responsible for an attack or convicted in courts in this country has either fought abroad or received terrorist training abroad. So there is demonstrably a threat from people who seek out jihadist violence abroad and then try to return to the UK. And I think what David Cameron was doing today, outlining today, is a range of measures in which he is attempting to keep Britain safe from these very people who will return. Some of them, many of them, the statistics would show about 1 in 9 may attempt to re-engage in terrorist activity. So the overwhelming majority, as Margaret was saying, can go back into their communities, be supported by the state, go through de-radicalisation programmes. But those that wish to attack us, these are the ones that we need to keep eyes on, we need to try and prosecute, and if we can't, then temporarily exclude them from the UK.
Well, Margaret Gilmore, if I can put to you the crucial question, are existing laws not sufficient to deal with this kind of issue? Here we are prosecuting or threatening to take action against people based on suspicion.
No, there has to be, yes, there has to be some kind of suspicion, but that would apply to any type of criminal. If you're suspicious, you may well get stopped and questioned by the police. It's clarifying. It is also addressing some of the issues that mainstream Muslims have had. They have said to the government, you are not doing enough to help people when they come back. You are not doing enough to stop our children going out there. In fact, the majority of people who've gone out to fight in Syria that are known about in the last year have been aged between 16 and 21. And a lot of their parents are saying, please help us, stop them. Help us to kind of communicate with them, stop them leaving the country. So these are issues that have been raised to a large extent by the Muslim community, which is now being addressed by a government, which is a democratic government, our government, and which knows that the ultimate responsibility of any democratic government is to keep us safe.
Well, Anjem Chowdhury, your response to that?
Well, I think that ultimately what the government is saying and what your other guests are saying, are really, very vague statements, because nobody has actually defined terrorism. If you look in the dictionary, the use of force against a community or a section of the community for political purposes is terrorism, and that's what the British government are doing in Iraq and Syria. I mean, you could argue that the people are in fact going to this area to defend their brethren. Let's face it, many people were going before to fight against Bashar al-Assad. Over 250,000 people have been slaughtered, and the British, in fact, William Hague and David Cameron were saying to the Free Syrian Army, we're going to support you militarily, we're going to support you logistically. In other words, the very people who are rising up against the brutal regime, and the people who are maybe following in their footsteps to do the same thing, are now being tarnished as terrorists. You must define these terms of radical, extremist and terrorism, otherwise they're going to be used as a big stick to beat everybody up. And it's quite telling that Muazzam Beg was arrested in February for saying that he wanted to go and actually set up a training camp for people to defend themselves. And the government dropped the case in September, just after they decided to go to war in Iraq and Syria. So, I mean, it's very vague. They haven't defined these terms, and they can catch just about everyone, within the Muslim community.
Well, Hannah Stewart, this is an issue in terms of the proposed legislation, the broadness of it, and at the same time, the narrowness of it, the insistence on singling out a particular conflict that is being fought. For example, many Kurds are going to go and fight ISIL in increasing numbers without any such restriction. This is a very narrowly focused act or proposal, which could lead to it being undervalued and being undercut, could it not?
Well, I think the thing we have to remember is that the primary aim of any government is to keep its citizens safe, and it has assessed, rightly I believe, I mean, we can all see this from the propaganda that groups like Islamic State put on the internet about their intents to attack us in our own country and send fighters back and encourage attacks from people based in the UK. So these measures, yes, there is a narrowness to them. There are many conflicts around the world, some which we're involved in and others which we're not, but what this is attempting to do is restrict the re-entry or allow citizens to re-enter under certain conditions. Individuals who have demonstrably gone abroad and fought with a group who has stated clearly their wish to attack us. Now that is narrow, but that's rightly narrow. They're narrowing it to the very threat, the biggest threat, the single biggest threat that we face at the moment.
Well, Margaret Gilmore, your view on this, the narrowness of the legislation, the danger that it singles out a particular segment of people rather than applying to all, which is the basis of most laws.
This isn't about singling out Muslims. This is about helping the vast majority of mainstream Muslims in the UK who disassociate themselves with those who want to go and fight with ISIS. And let's not forget that ISIS are killing more Muslims than they are anybody else or any other race or any other religion. This is about trying to help mainstream Muslims. In a way, we should look at the argument slightly detaching from this, it's an attack on, or it's not. Is this the right legislation? That's the question. I have some reservations about stopping people, the police having the extra powers now to stop the police, to stop people and take their passports as they are leaving. I actually think that keeping that power with the Home Secretary with a lot of checks and balances is the better way of doing it, and broadening and loosening those powers to allow more people to have it is not such a good thing, because I think you might find gap year students and what have you may find themselves caught up, and I think there will be legal challenge over it. But ultimately, we do have a big problem, and this is about helping our Muslim communities, our Muslim brothers and sisters, as well as trying to keep the country safe.
Well, I will return to a couple of points that he brought up there, but I want to go to Anjem Chowdhury, who no doubt wishes to respond to that. But if I could also make the point that the legislation is aimed at fighters. It does not use any religious determinant within the language of these proposed bills.
Well, we have to look at this in context. Remember, this is the government which is implementing stop and search, which is almost exclusively used against the Muslim community. This is the government which uses Schedule 7, to question people for up to 6 to 9 hours at the airports. This is the government, which said at their latest conference that they want to introduce legislature which will ban people, even though they're not breaking the law. And now they say that they want to arrest people, when they come back. Boris Johnson, the Lord Mayor, or rather rather the Mayor of London, said that there should be a presumption of guilt when people go abroad. So, you know, if we look at these things in context, they are absolutely targeting the Muslim community. The Muslim community at the current time, you know, are feeling like second-class citizens. There's an apartheid system. You know, you're not really English or British, which incidentally, which is what I was saying, and many people like me were saying all along, that we're Muslims first and last, and we will never be accepted in any other culture or civilization. Therefore, we need to have our own state and implement the Sharia. So I think people will be heartened by the fact that they're being rejected by these countries, and they will flock, in fact, to the Islamic State, where I think they'll be, you know, they'll be embraced with open arms, in fact.
Well, Hannah Stewart, let's just return to the essence of the legislation itself. Now, the safeguards in it, the legal safeguards in it, is that it is for a 30-day period, the removal of the passport or confiscation of passport, to be reviewed by a magistrate after 14 days. Do you think that this is sufficient legal safeguard in terms of protecting fairly fundamental human right, which is to travel freely?
Well, I think we have to remember, actually, that having citizenship, while citizenship is a right, actually holding a passport and the ability to travel isn't. Having a passport is a privilege, and the Home Secretary, under royal prerogative, maintains the right to refuse passports and to take them as and when she sees fit. This legislation is simply widening that power to the police when there's reasonable suspicion that people are attempting to travel abroad for terrorist purposes. Now, I think we need to think very carefully about the checks and balances, and certainly there will need to be, I think, some sort of restorative compensation if people's passports have been taken unfairly and that has impacted, for example, a planned holiday or a business trip. And so I think it's good that there's magistrates involved. There could also be an independent oversight body that assesses the impact of the legislation on a 6-month or yearly basis.
Well, Anjem Chowdhury, as somebody who has had his passport removed, what's your response to the safeguards contained in the proposal?
You know, when you have a biased police and a biased Crown Prosecution Service and a biased government and a biased police force, and, you know, the juries have been subject to all of the propaganda against Islam or Muslims, there is no fair trial, you know, for Muslims, or there's no kind of reasonableness here. You know, the law itself is completely, you know, targeting the Muslim community to make sure they don't go and go to the Islamic State, support their brothers, and to live by the Sharia. So in the first place, it's anti-Islam and anti-Muslim. So, you know, the reasonableness test is completely irrelevant. The law itself is against Islam. So, you know, how can a magistrate interpret it any differently? They're basically being asked to say, well, is the government therefore, right to, if you like, bring this law in, which obviously they're not going to argue with that, are they? They're going to implement it, which is, as I say, is something which is in its essence against Islam and Muslims. So it doesn't matter about the checks and balances. The law needs to be changed, and we need to have, you know, equality between Muslims and non-Muslims in this country. If you believe in things like equality before the law, innocence until proven guilt, freedom of expression and freedom of religion, then where is that for the Muslim community nowadays?
Margaret Gilmore, as you can see, the discussion is along the lines of... Yes, Hannah Stewart, you wanted to say something?
I just wanted to ask Anjem Chowdhury, what is it about anti-terrorism legislation that he thinks isn't equal? Both Muslims and non-Muslims are treated equally in front of the law by anti-terrorism legislation. It is not belief or speech or thought that is criminalised. It is actions, activity, travelling abroad and fighting with, joining and being a member of a prescribed organisation, much like the organisation which you belong to and lead, which is a prescribed organisation.
Well, Anjem Chowdhury, your response.
Can I come back to that?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, basically, look, I can say that under the terrorism legislature, you know, organizations and bodies which I've been affiliated to have been banned, maybe about 9 or 10 of them, and we have never called for any terrorist activities here or abroad.
There's
we are simply a political and ideological movement. We are political and ideological movement. We expose the British government. We expose their foreign policy, and for these reasons, the Home Secretary has banned us. You know, I've never been arrested for and charged with any terrorism offences whatsoever in the last 20 years. What has changed is the government bringing in more and more draconian measures and trying to silence people.
Okay, one more question,
Ask
Hannah.
2 questions, yeah.
Anjem, after 7/7, Anjem, your leader at the time, Omar Bakri Mohammed, said to people in a private meeting that 7/7 meant jihad had come to the UK and you can do what you want. Were you in the room when he said that? Did you hear him say that? And do you support your followers committing acts of terrorism in the UK?
No, he never said anything like that. We've always said that we believe in a covenant of security. In return for our wealth and life being protected here, we are not allowed to target the wealth and the life of the people with whom we live. However, what we've also said is that that is not the only opinion. Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State and the Shabab do not have this opinion, and therefore if they send their own troops and their soldiers, then we are very responsible to say that we have a responsibility and you have a responsibility and the government have a responsibility to stop the atrocious foreign policy which is occupying Muslim land. Let's face it, I mean, we need to live in the real world.
Why
the Muslims in Afghanistan, Iraq and Syria are not occupying Manchester, Birmingham and New York. You are taking your troops and occupying Muslim land, and therefore that would have repercussions.
Well, let's actually give our third guest here. We do have three guests at the moment.
Why is it that 1 in 7?
If you just hold on 1 second, Hannah Stewart, let's give a voice here to Margaret Gilmore. Your view, Margaret, in terms of the discussions that have just been occurring.
I think what is good about the way you've been leading the discussion up till now, Mike, is that you're trying to deal with the bigger, wider issues. And there are some elements who are trying to force this people into this them and us mentality. And it's not a them and us mentality. We are talking about a very, very, very tiny number of people who happen to be Muslims, who are on the extreme, who have a tendency and want to take violent action against innocent people and who are a threat to my safety and the safety of other people in this country. And that is what this is all about. And we can have little battles with the people who have the more extreme views, but actually let's remember the vast majority of Muslims in the UK do not share the views of Anjem Choudhury. They have very different views, and many of them will be welcoming some of what's happening today. The big issues are, have we overstepped the mark? Have we got the balance right or wrong between security and liberty? I think we're getting very close to going too far towards security, and we have to watch very carefully about giving the police more powers without the checks and balances already in place. But anybody who disagrees with it, and I predict this will happen, will bring legal challenges to ensure that human rights and civil rights in our democracy are upheld.
Well, Margaret Gilmore, I just want to ask a follow-up question. You mentioned that this is hundreds of people, not thousands, hundreds of people could be affected by this legislation. Why then do you need national legislation to deal with a minute few?
Because they're the dangerous people. I mean, this isn't about the vast majority of people. This isn't about the aid convoys. This isn't about people who've gone out and think, oh, I've made a terrible mistake and have come back. This is about a very small number of people, and all the evidence is there. Evidence of people coming back, by the way, I've met them. All the evidence is there of the tiny majority of people who not only have very extreme views, but also have the gene in them or whatever it is, which allows them to be violent. I couldn't harm somebody. I doubt if you could, Mike, but these are people who are happy to bring out a butcher's knife and behead somebody. And, that tiny majority of people, it's identifying them and trying to stop them carrying out some attack on the streets of the UK.
Well, Anjem Choudhury, your view about that? We're mentioning the figure hundreds, the idea that legislation is being applied against a minute amount of people.
Actually, the figures are completely arbitrary, and when you look at the law, it is very, broad brush. And, I would say to your guests, it is an us and them mentality. I live in the Muslim community. I know the vast majority of the Muslims, especially the practicing Muslims, will see this legislature as targeting them. Because remember, people are not just going to the Islamic State. They're also going to places like Chechnya, they're going to Palestine, they're going to many other places. What they will see is the hypocrisy. How is it that Jews can go to occupied Palestine, join the IDF, kill thousands of people, it's called self-defense, and no one is arrested? They won't apply this legislature to them. They will only apply it to the Muslims. And what I would say to you is that the only people from the so-called Muslim community who will agree with this are the paid-up lackeys, people like the, whatever you call them, the Quilliam Foundation, the people on the money of the government.
Choudhury, I must point out that a number of prominent leaders have in fact backed this legislation, prominent Muslim leaders. But Hannah Stewart, what we're hearing here as well is it's not necessarily the reality, it's what people think about it. Now, legislation like this does create this type of reaction and certainly this type of feeling, perhaps in a minority, but that feeling is there. Can this legislation work while these perceptions exist?
I think one of the problems for this government and the previous government is that since both 9/11 and 7/7, there are a number of different perceptions of our state responses to terrorism and radicalisation, and not all of them have been positive. And that's to be expected. Any government policy, and a controversial one, particularly our foreign policy over the last decade and our de-radicalisation strategy, the PREVENT strategy, these are controversial policies and they will engender a number of different reactions. And it's the government's responsibility to put in place the policies that it thinks are going to be the most effective, and then to robustly defend them from criticism and accept that that dissent and criticism, when it falls short of the law and it is simply speech and thought and protest and not violence, that is legal. But what the government cannot do is be held hostage by a small minority of people who threaten violence when they're upset by the way that policy is going forward.
Well, it's a discussion that can continue and will continue. My thanks to our guests, Hannah Stewart, Anjem Chowdhury and Margaret Gilmore. And why not add your voice to this discussion? You can leave your comments at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. We're also on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. I'm Mike Hanna. Thanks for watching and goodbye for now.